So for each of us, that may look differently, but there are definitely some commonalities that we will. So let's discuss some of the commonalities, mostly what we know. Now, in case many of us are not familiar with how money grows, in order for it to grow, it has to change one hand to another in order for right now. When it moves from one person's hand to another, we can look at this as where there's a development of interest. Interest being the additional charge to incentivize somebody to invest and hurry up and pay back that money, right? Now, you also have what's oftentimes, likened to a song by a group called Naughty by Nature, where they used to sing, "You down with OPP?" Well, let's think about OPM, okay? Other people's money. Now, when it comes to interest, and money is moving from one person's hands to another person's hands, it's another person's money going to another person's pocket. That other person has an obligation to repay that person back with interest, right? Now, I just want to say that because I want to show how it all is connected, right? Now, in regards to interest, types of interest, and this is going to help address that question that I was talking about. How can I get $1 million in unmarked bills starting at $100? Well, one way that you may approach that is by fixed interest. And a fixed interest is a percentage on an investment or loan on time that's supposed to be paid back over time. So fixed interest is oftentimes looked at as a safe way of building bits or growing your money, but it also can be seen as a very slow way of growing your profit. So for those of you who are looking for ways to safely and conservatively or grow your money maybe over time, I want to invite you to consider looking into high interest savings account. Right now, with a high interest savings account at a place like HSBC, they offer you high interest rates of 1.2% or higher. Okay. And we'll talk more about that in a second. I just want to plant that seed so that way we can kind of move on to the other type of interest that exists, which is called compound interest. You'll see compound interest, particularly on loans or even investments. Okay, now the difference with compound interest versus fixed interest is that remember that it's the amount of time difference. Okay, now if you have an investment of say $1,000, it's supposed to grow by 10% annually, then that 10% is what we call the rate of return. Okay. Now, in the first year, if you put $1,000 in and you got a rate of return of 10%, at the end of the year, you've got $1,100 profit, 10% from that initial amount. From that 1,100 start with in year number at the end of year one, moving into the end of year number two, you'll have grown an additional 10%, and that 10% would be an amount of another $110, right? Totaling in 1210. And you can see through this example here that all the way down to year seven, well, the interest has grown on it so much that it's almost doubled the initial investment or loan. So for those that may not be familiar with the rule of 72, let me just briefly explain what this is, which is simply put an approximation on how long it takes an investment to double based on the interest. Okay. Now, in this previous example of compound interest, we look at a 10% rate of return, right? That's the compound interest. Now, if we divide 72 by 10, that will give us 7.2. And we say the 7.2 is the number of years that it takes for the actual initial investment to have grown. Now, when I say initial investment, I mean a one-time investment. right? So in the first year, we took $1,000 and we put it into an investment, right? Or we loaned it to someone where we gave them, let's say 10 years for them to repay the loan, right? Well, we want a 10% term on that loan. You with me so far? We gave somebody $1,000. We're going to give them 10 years to repay the loan, 10% annually. Now, we understand that by the rule of 72, it's going to take us 7 years and about a month and a half for our initial $1,000 to double, basically become how much? Anybody want to unmute themselves and say how much that $1,000 is going to double into? 2,000. I appreciate the participation. So let's talk about credit. Let's keep moving, right? When it comes to credit, you've got these three main credit bureaus, and their job is to accurately and fairly report all information regarding your credit history. Right? Now, some of us are really primarily concerned with credit scores, but the credit score being important, I want to also introduce you to your FICO score, used to calculate many different parts of your credit data in your credit. The data is grouped into five categories, which comprise of payment history, which is the biggest part of it, 35%, the amounts that you to 30%, the length of credit history at 15%, new credit history, excuse me, length of credit history at 15%, new credit history at 10%, credit mixtures 10%. All right. So I'm gonna kind of go over some of these components in your FICO score. But if your FICO score doesn't have this kind of a balance, it's going to affect how your credit worthiness is determined by the credit reporting agency. Let's say that, in, for example, looking at just the payment history, the first thing any lender wants to know is whether or not you've paid past credit accounts, right? It helps the lender figure out how much time, how much risk they'll take on them without extending, and they're extending the credit. And the most important factor in a is this payment history. So for those of you who maybe already have credit, or maybe you are looking ways to improve your credit. Uh, I'm sorry, say again, or if you could please just mute yourselves. Thank you. So you where was that? The payment history, right? Um, for those of you who may be looking to start a credit history for your children, one of the best things you can do as a parent, if you've got a pretty decent credit score, is you can add your child on as an authorized user. Okay. And so what you'll be doing is extending your payment history to them. That's another way for them to inherit, right? If you're someone who maybe doesn't have the best credit history or best credit score, you can talk to someone who may be older than you, who may have a good line of credit, and a good payment history, and also ask like, hey, can you hook me up with some payment history? Put me on as an authorized user. Okay, so I hope you're getting a couple of tips and you're taking some notes as well, because I want to show you how to master your finances is, and it's by applying the things that you're learning here. Okay, so let's talk about Mounts Gold, which again represents for 30%. Right now, uh, in general, whenever you get a line of credit, you have what's called the total credit utilization. Right, and let's say that the best amount of credit utilization that you could ever apply or use is 30% maximum. Okay, anything more than 30% is going to negatively affect FICO scores, which is going to also reflect your credit score, right? So The amounts owed, having credit accounts and owing money on them does not necessarily mean you are a high risk borrower with a low FICO score. However, if you are using a lot of your available credit, it may indicate that you are overextended, and banks can interpret this to mean that you are at higher risk of default. So if you go above your 30% credit utilization, banks and creditors are going to say, well, there's a much larger chance that they may miss a payment. They're not, that's going to affect their payment history, right? They don't want to do that. That's going to hurt their FICO score as well. But it also means that there's a lower chance of them paying us. There's a higher chance of not paying us, whichever way you want to kind of look at that. Ultimately, it's not good for anybody. So, you know, again, when people are getting lines of credit, it's important that they understand this 20 to 30% maximum to 70 to 80% maximum of credit utilization. Okay. Don't go above the 30% of your utilization. Now, for the length of history in general, having a longer credit history is positive for your FICO score, but it is not required for good credit score. Okay. So remember, FICO matters more than credit score. All right. Because your FICO score takes into account these following things: how long your credit accounts have been established, including the age of your oldest account, the age of your newest account, and an average age of all your accounts, which can be a positive reflection on your credit worthiness. All right. How long specific credit accounts have been established, how long it has been since
I
you
like those
used
bars.
certain accounts. These things are also very important to consider, right? So credit mix is simply, what FICO scores will be considered based on retail accounts, installment loans, finance company accounts, and mortgage loans. Don't worry, it's not necessary to have one of each, but it's important to know some of these credit categories. And also, based on where your particular financial challenges or financial interests may be, it's important for you to understand the mixture, right? Or how much that type of credit style or product will impact your FICO score. Okay. And then you also have new credit. Okay. So research shows that opening several credit accounts in a short amount of time represents a greater risk, especially for people who don't have a long credit history. So if you're thinking about applying for credit, it's a good idea that you don't apply for credit more than once with an approval every 6 months. Okay. If you do more than one credit application, number one, every time they do a credit inquiry, it's going to be an impact on your credit score. Okay. So you got to think about that drop. And in that drop, you got to think about how long it's going to take for you to become positive. That may be after 6 months or more. So after 6 months, you can go to that creditor and maybe say like, "Hey, I've been with you. I've been paying my bills on time. Um, Either could you increase the amount of credit, and what'll that do? It'll reduce your total credit utilization and increase the amount of limit, and that'll also reflect positively. So these are things that you should definitely consider doing and adding into your financial planning. All right, especially when it comes to you considering applying for credit. Now, let's say let's ask some serious questions. Like, if I make payments every month, why doesn't my balance go? And how many people are accustomed to just paying the minimum payment every month? Now, for the people who have their hands up, keep your hand up if you understand how that minimum payment is calculated. I saw like one or two hands, right? So talk about that. Let's say that you have a MasterCard, right, with a balance of $4,950 and a minimum payment of $100 with an interest rate of 19.90. Now, if anybody wants to like do that quick rule of 72 calculation, right, think about how that interest rate is going to affect how quickly the creditor is able to double their money on issuing credit, right? And then I want you to also consider, as we move through these next slides, you know, how much risk is being increased that a person defaults because they don't understand how minimum payment actually is calculated. So let's do this, right? How much do you think goes to paying down a balance from $100 a month, right? Well, let's say that there's a finance charge of about $913.41 based on a total of 19.90, right? Now, that those finance charges, when you actually divide that 913 up into 365 days for the entire year, actually becomes $2.70 in interest. Now, here's where it really gets to be crazy. All right. I know somebody likes to talk about rabbit holes. We're about to spiral into a rabbit. At $2.70 per day, by 30 to 31 days on average, it's $83.66 that you're actually calculating on the interest. Okay. That's the total credit balance, right? Like even if that was a one-time charge of 4,950, all right, the interest rate on that, 1990. Okay, divide that up by 365 days, and then calculate that from how many days in a month on average. $83.66 alone goes to interest. Okay, now if $83.66 goes to the interest, what's left over is the $16.34 that actually goes to paying down the balance. That might have gone over somebody's, but let's assume that the card was not used for one full year and that payments were made on time, right? So the balance owed has decreased from $4,000 to $754.19, even though the person may have paid over $1,162 in minimum payments. That should be enough to make somebody a little bit concerned, right? That you put in over $1,000 but it hasn't chipped away at the actual balance. This is why people stay in debt because we may not understand these concepts of how these minimum payments could be hurting us, right? So the balance has only gone down by $195 a month. Let's repeat the steps from this point forward. Okay. Balance of $4,754, a minimum payment of $94, and an interest rate of 19.90%. $4,754 times 19.90, it's $80.35 to interest alone and $13.05 balance owed. Did it catch anybody else too? Well, if $83.66 goes to the interest, then what's left over, 1634 goes to pay down the balance. And if it was at $80.35 to the interest and 1365 towards the balance owed, what's happening? Why is it that the payments seem to be slowing down? It's slowing down because the minimum payments are calculated as a percentage of the outstanding balance. So remember, they're chipping away at the interest, but they're not paying out the actual balance. So because the balance stays at such a high amount, the actual decrease in debt no longer to be eliminated, right? So if you did keep the payment steady at $100, let's look at that, right? They'll pay the $80.35 in interest towards interest, and then the remaining $19.65 goes towards the balance. And this is just with the payment of $100. Now, by not lowering the amount being sent, you will actually accelerate the payment down. Okay, and we're going to show you another way of how like what's considered to be called like debt stacking or debt snowballing, right? By maintaining a consistent amount of payment every month. Okay. Um, but now somebody may be asking, well, what about some of the perks that come along with the credit cards? You know, they kind of incentivize you to spend a certain way, but they didn't really break down to you how interest payments are calculated, right? They didn't exactly explain to you how long they're calculating you to have to repay the minimum payment and how much more money they're going to make as a result. You not understanding that. Well, if they think that you're doing so well with not understanding everything, look at how they kind of set us up for failure, right? Now, if anyone's ever looked at their Capital One credit card statement, and they have this section in there under the important disclosures, this particular section right here, where they talk about the APR, annual percentage purchases. Now, I'm going to say this very, very slow. The 0% introductory APR through your 11/20/14 billing period. Okay, so for 1 year, for 12 months, there was 0% on the annual percentage any that were made. After that, though, there will be an annual percentage rate of 12.9%, 16.9%, or 20.9% based on your credit worthiness. Did anyone else catch that the interest rate increased? Did anyone else catch that? Now, remember, this is credit. This isn't you making profit, right? So because it's not you making profit, who's it making money for? The creditor, the people who gave you the credit, right? So let's look at this. Let's really dive into this real quick, okay? Because let's say that you did a one-time purchase of $1,800, right? Now, for the first 12 months, there's no percentage on it, but you're making a minimum payment, right? After that 12 months, the interest rate goes from 0 to 16.9% based on your credit worthiness. And well, what about the perks that they give, right? Like cash back on you spending certain amounts. Well, they give you 1.5% cash back. And on a one-time purchase, you made a $27 credit. Woohoo! Isn't that crazy? Isn't that great? Makes you want to smile, right? Well, let's think about this because remember, 16.9% is the interest rate. Let's calculate what that interest rate actually looks like. $22 of it goes to the interest from a $30 minimum payment, and what's left over, $8, actually goes towards the principal. Now, let's look at 1 year later because at the end of 1 year, a person may have made $356 in total payments, which more than double went to the interest, and a smaller amount went towards the principal. Well, let's keep, all right? Because hey, person got back $27 after 2 years, but still owes $1,445. Hasn't even made a dent yet. Well, not just in middle America, but also in lower income America, right? Traditional financial institutions like banks have enabled high debt levels. Borrowers are at the brink of their ability to pay. The average credit card debt among households with balances on their credit cards, $15,799. The Federal Reserve estimates each of those households has 3.5 credit cards, almost 4 times this amount. let's talk about how to get out of that though. So we talked about it very briefly. I introduced it to you, the concept of debt stacking, debt snowballing. And the way that most people are going to pay off their debt, you know, most people put some money, as much as they can towards paying off a debt fast. Okay, but I want to show people, I want to show you guys how sometimes paying off a debt with, adding a little bit of money here and there could actually be hurting your plan for getting out of debt fast. So like here it is that we have this example where, a person has a total of $309,000 paying at the end of all their debts. Their current balance is though $260,000 in current debt. That's where the debt is now. The total average interest rate on this debt is 7.21%. So based on this, there's about a 10-year period that we can expect that if the person does not get these debts satisfied with, right, it's going to double. Now, including all the interest that gets accrued, from they're making the minimum payments. This is what their minimum payments look like on a monthly basis, right? Could you imagine that? Someone paying $2,000 every month towards bills, and $320 of that is going to additional payments towards those bills, right? Where they're not being informed of how those interest rates are being calculated, right? So here's our solution to this problem. We say, okay, you were putting $320 in additional income towards your debt. What if we put that total $320 towards one debt, right? Say, for example, this person's Chase MasterCard, right? Well, after we've included that $320 towards what their initial minimum payment was, the new monthly payment is $344. Now, the projected interest that we would save what we save these people, 717.30. $1,730 is how much we're projecting to pay this off, right? Save this interest. This amount gets saved in interest. What do we do with this freed up money? This new $344 that we just freed up from one payment? Well, we apply it to another card or another debt. Or previously, you were only making a minimum payment amount of $32, but now we added $344 to that, making the new monthly payment $306. What's the interest that we save on that? $606.97. We freed up that $376. What are we going to do with that 376? Right, starting to get it. We're snowballing. We're putting the 376 into the next minimum payment, pay that debt off faster. And at the end of it, we've helped a family save a lot of interest. Okay. A lot of money in interest. And think about what families could be doing with the interest that money that they're saving, not having to pay it towards interest, right? So not many people that we talk to actually have homes, but there are some people that we talk to that do have homes. So for those that may have homes, I'm inviting you to message me directly and to hey, feel free to DM me or send me an email to L O Wellness, ELFLO Wellness at gmail.com with any of your